Today we're going to be reading a story called Mbulumila, the Clay Monster by Julius Oelke. There's an important question that we're going to look at first. What are the implications of the traditional African saying, a person is a person through other people? If we think about it, who we are, what we want to do, what we want to become, is all only possible through the help or with the involvement of other people. And this question becomes very important in the story if we watch how people relate to the monster, Mbulumila, how they relate to the people that rescue them, how they relate to each other. We're also going to ask the question, why do people do everything that Mbulumila commands them to do? And also, what does it mean when we say, work together as though you are all the cutting edge of the same knife? What could that possibly mean? So let's start reading the story now. Long ago, there lived a terrible person named Mbulumila, a bloodthirsty man-monster. The people of the town where he lived were so afraid of him that they did whatever he commanded. It never occurred to anyone that they could drive him away if they would only stand together. They all completely forgot the saying that goes, work together as though you are all the cutting edge of the same knife. One day Mbulumila commanded the people to make some good thick clay. The men and women kneaded the clay with their feet and wondered uneasily what the monster was going to do with it. Now I want you to plaster me with clay from head to heel, you hear? He ordered in a loud voice. The people did as they were told. When they had finished, Mbulumila asked, now what do I look like? Just like an ox, the people called out. Another layer, screamed Mbulumila. When he had been covered with a second layer of clay, he asked, now what do I look like? And the people said, just like a hippopotamus. Another layer, screamed Mbulumila. When the third layer of clay was hardening on his body, he asked, now what do I look like? Just like an elephant, answered the people. Are you all scared of me yet? Mbulumila wanted to know. We are too scared to even look at you, said the people, wringing their hands and rolling their eyes. Another layer of clay, ordered Mbulumila again. But when the people had plastered him with the fourth layer of clay, he looked so monstrous and terrifying that they all began shaking with fear and fled into the bushes. Come back here right now, roared Mbulumila. Go and fetch the castor oil and rub it in so that the clay doesn't become hard and cracked. The people trembled, but they did as commanded. They rubbed the oil deep into the clay. No one thought about the fact that they could all stand up to him and refuse to do any more work for him. And then Mbulumila went to sleep. He slept for days and days. When eventually he awoke, the clay had become a part of his body. He was a clay monster. So let's stop there for a minute and think about what we've read so far. The story is repeating the fact that the people don't realize their power in working together. Okay, it tells us in the very first paragraph that they completely forgot the saying, that if they worked together, they could be very powerful, they could be as sharp as a knife. And it constantly reminds us the narrative that they keep obeying this monster, and not only do they obey him, they actually help him to become an even more terrifying monster. So they think they're afraid, but they create even more fear for themselves by helping him to become a more terrifying monster. So think about what this could possibly symbolize in life. What kind of situations do you think we could relate this to? Eventually, he's a terrifying monster. Uh, he's a clay monster, and all the people that are afraid of him have actually helped him to become this way. So let's go back to the story. He left his home and wandered far into the wide world until he came to a village where the people owned vast herds of fat, healthy cattle. The monster brought death and destruction upon the entire village and took the cattle for himself. The next morning he grinned and grimaced with pleasure beneath the skin of clay and set out with his herds of cattle for the grazing lands. That same morning, shortly after Mbulumila had left for the veldt with his cattle, a young boy arrived at the desolate village. He and his sister and their parents had fled their own village to escape a terrible famine. On the way, the adults had decided that it would be better if the children were to search for food on their own, and their father had abandoned them in the middle of the bush. That morning, the boy had spotted a cattle track from his vantage point at the top of a small hill. He followed the track all the way to the village in the hope of finding food, leaving his sister searching for roots and bulbs and berries that they might eat. Strange that everything's so quiet, said the boy to himself as he entered the village. Not a dog barking, no children's voices laughing, no women's voices calling comfortably back and forth. He peeked in at the doors and saw that the houses were still packed with food, although there wasn't a single person in the village. The calabashes were full of curdled milk. There was meal, there were sweet potatoes. The poor boy was so hungry that he just ate everything he could lay his hands on, but he didn't forget his sister. When he had done this, he took some food and went to find her where she was still foraging in the bush. They quickly had a fire burning and, that's better. Soon the coals were sizzling with the sweet brown juice of the sweet potatoes. That night they slept in a tree for fear of the wild animals, and when the sun lit the morning sky with red, they clambered down and followed the cattle track back to the deserted village. Even though their own parents had abandoned them, they would take care of themselves just fine. Okay, so let's continue. There must have already been cattle passed here early this morning, said the boy. That means there must be people around here somewhere. But the village still stood empty. The children moved into one of the houses. They couldn't believe their luck. They had more than enough to eat. That night they heard the lowing of cattle. Shortly afterwards, a cloud of dust billowed up from the cattle track, and the children heard something singing above the lowing and rumbling of the cattle. Mbulumila is my name, the monster of clay that eats the flesh of humans. The children froze with fear. We must hide away, whispered the girl urgently. They quickly scrambled up a ladder to the sleeping quarters just beneath the roof of the house. There they huddled in a dark corner. Kadum, kadum, they heard as the monster came nearer. They heard as he sniffed the night wind. I smell human flesh. I smell human flesh. He searched and searched. When he came to the children's house, he roared. This place smells of human flesh, just like human flesh. He could see the coals still glowed in the fireplace, and he searched the entire house for the children. But there was dust in his eyes from the clay, and he didn't see them crouching in the loft. Snuffling and cursing, the monster eventually went off to go to sleep. The next morning, the children made a plan. Look, said the boy to his sister, we must heat a large rock until it is red hot, and then we must get it up into the loft. And if that monster decides to climb up here with his big clay mouth hanging open, we'll throw the glowing rock down his throat, she said. The whole day the children stoked the fire with the rock in the middle. That night they heard the cattle lowing again, louder than the cattle. They heard Mbulumila call, "Mbulumila is my name, the monster of clay that eats the flesh of humans." With trembling hands and strong sticks, the children managed to get the red-hot rock into a large basin, which they carefully carried up to the highest room. And there they waited. "I smell human flesh! I smell human flesh!" The monster's voice reverberated through the silent village. "Kadoom! Kadoom!" He stormed towards the children's house, where the fire still burnt brightly in the twilight gloom. "This is where it smells of human flesh. This must be where the humans are," roared Mbulumila, and thundered into the house. This time he climbed up the ladder and felt with his rough clay hands all around the loft until he came upon the children in their dark corner. He opened his mouth wide to devour them, but before he could do so, the girl and the boy seized the basin and hurled the glowing rock down his throat. The monster crashed to the floor and lay there, lifeless, between pieces of shattered clay. And then the brother and sister heard the voice of a child floating from the open hanging mouth of the monster. "You who killed the clay monster, won't you rescue us from this prison?" The astonished brother and sister realized that the voice came from inside the disgusting body of clay. They grabbed Mbulumila's great stabbing spear and sliced open the vast belly. Out stepped the chief and all the other adults and children of the village. They sang, they danced, they knelt before the brother and sister, stretched out their arms and gave them thanks with the palms of their hands pressed together. "We all owe our lives to these two children," said the chief. "From now on the entire village will take care of them." And all the people immediately ran to their houses to fetch gifts and food for the brave brother and sister. But the gratitude didn't last for long. Before much time had passed, the elders of the village had begun conferring in hushed voices, and they began to encourage the people of the village not to look after these two foreign children any more. "After all, they are not of our tribe," said the elders. The chief caught wind of these whispers. He called his people together and commanded them once again to treat the children with care and respect. But the elders were nursing terrible thoughts. One day, when the boy and girl were fetching water from the river, the evildoers overcame them, killed them, and threw their bodies into the deepest part of the river. Immediately, an ominous quiet fell over the river, so foreboding that the elders' hearts froze with fear, and they fled back to their homes. When the women of the village came that morning to draw water, it was though 1,000 lamenting voices were wailing through the reeds. Suddenly the woman heard clearly from the water the voices of the brother and sister. "You who draw water at this place, was it not we who rescued you from misery?" Over and over protested the voices from the water. The woman turned and ran with empty calabashes back to the village and told the chief what they had heard. They shook with fear, for now they knew what had happened to the children. The chief went down to the river himself, just as he was lowering his calabash into the river and the water was beginning to gurgle through the neck. He heard the whispering of the reeds, and then the voices of the brother and sister. "You who draw water from this place, remember that it was we who rescued you from your misery." The sweat rolled down from the chief's brow. "Go and listen at the windows of the houses, and tell me who was it that did such a thing," he ordered the woman. Soon he knew the names of the guilty parties. The elders were made to pay for the terrible deed with their lives. The people of the village would not return to draw water from that place. We cannot bear to hear those voices, they said, and went far from there to find a new place for drawing water. So in this story, we see that the children, the brother and the sister, they acted together to kill the monster. Together, they managed to do something which a whole village of people had not managed to do. But then what happens? The elders of the village take revenge because they let their fears get the better of them and they imagine terrible things. And the elders act together to murder the two children. So when you act together, it can be for good or for bad, and unfortunately in this case, for bad, although eventually their deaths are vindicated when the chief finds out exactly what has happened. So here you can have a look at these questions and answers a bit later on. Now we're going to look at what kind of story this is. We're going to try and decide, does it have features of a fairy tale or a folk tale? How would it be presented, this story? Okay, so what elements in this story belong to that of the fairy tale? Are there magical elements? Can you think of any? I think so, because the clay, even though we can relate to clay and oil making the clay soft, it somehow becomes, it creates a sort of magical, all-powerful monster. So there is this kind of magical element. Is there a moral lesson? There's definitely a moral lesson, which is to do with that quote that is repeated, the power of people working together. They can work together for good or bad, but they can certainly shape a better future for themselves if they work together. What about stock characters? Like, are the characters predictably good or bad? Well, the monster is certainly a bad monster. He's not really a complex character. Although initially he seems to be just like everybody else until everybody allows him to become a terrifying monster. Is there a happy ending? Well, in this case, it's kind of bittersweet, isn't it? Because the children are dead, but at least they are respected by the chief and the village, some of the villagers. Yes, so there are definitely elements of a fairy tale. In fact, we can even recognize this idea of abandoned children. That happens in some stories like Hansel and Gretel. The Matchstick Girl is another fairy tale where there's a child all alone, abandoned in the snow. So that is quite a common theme in fairy tales, where children are facing tremendously difficult circumstances and they manage to find a way out of this experience. Then there's a monster who eats human flesh. That also happens in quite a few fairy tales, even in, I think, Jack and the Beanstalk. So those are definitely elements of a fairy tale. Are there any elements of a folk tale? Yes, well, it seems to be set in a traditional African village, so there are definitely cultural roots. There's part realistic roots and part sort of cultural themes. We recognize the cattle, the food. So there are elements of both fairy tales and folk tales in this story. And the monster does, even though he's quite crafty, he does at least manage to get defeated. So that's a positive side of the story. So going back to the moral of the story, this story has some wonderful insights that can help us actually in our lives. We have to be able to recognize how we help other people become monsters, or how we help others gain power over us. And this monster, Mbulumila, is quite clever because he gets people to cooperate with him. People almost invest in him. There's also this idiom to have feet of clay, which is quite interesting because it means that even though people appear to be powerful and terrifying, they can actually be quite brittle and easy to defeat. So there's some great insights in this story that we can use. And going back to this concept of Ubuntu, which Nelson Mandela also explained to us, it's the profound sense that we are human only through the humanity of others. That if we are to accomplish anything in this world, it will be in equal measure due to the work and achievement of others. So this is the wonderful moral of this story.